Voice leading. In tonal music, a chord is understood to move to one that follows, so that a series of chords form a harmonic progression or chord progression. When one chord moves to another, each note in the first chord moves to a note in the next. In four-part harmony, this creates four separate melodic lines called voices. The guidelines for voice leading in four-part harmony exercises tend to be stricter than actual musical practice, when the specific artistic contexts often give rise to exception to these rules we will go over. In four-part harmony, the three upper voices, soprano, alto, and tenor, should move smoothly, mostly with small melodic intervals. Usually, upper voices either stay on the same note or move by step or third, and they never use leaps greater than a sixth. The bass line, on the other hand, frequently uses melodic leaps. When a chord repeats or is sustained, on the other hand, melodic leaps in one or more of the upper voices are not a problem. These leaps are called chord skips. Although melodic leaps are common in the bass, even there you should avoid leaps greater than an octave or leaps of a seventh. Melodic augmented intervals should not appear in any voice. In all voices, you should avoid approaching a leading tone with an ascending melodic leap. Motion between intervals. Instead of thinking about all four voices at once, it can be helpful to think about them in pairs, like soprano and alto, or soprano and bass. For each pair of voices, you should think about intervals formed and how these intervals are approached. Each interval may be approached in one of 5 different ways. The 5 ways are contrary motion. One voice moves up and the other moves down. Parallel motion. The two voices move in the same direction and the same distance. The interval size stays the same, but the quality might change. Similar motion. The voices move in the same direction but different distances. Oblique motion. One voice remains on the same note while the other moves up or down. Stationary motion. Both voices remain on the same note. The voice leading from one chord to another in four-part harmony can be understood as involving a number of simultaneous motions between pairs of voices. In this chord progression, the soprano and alto approach a fifth in oblique motion. The soprano and tenor approach a third in parallel motion. The soprano and bass approach a fifth in contrary motion. The tenor and alto approach a sixth in oblique motion. The alto and bass approach an octave in oblique motion. And the bass and tenor approach a third in contrary motion. Listen to how all these different types of motions come together in all four voices. Before we delve into the 2 most crucial rules in voice leading, let's observe these types of motion in an actual piece of music. Here, we have the first theme in Mozart's Fantasy in D minor. We won't analyze the entire passage, but we'll focus on key moments showcasing different types of motion. First, let's examine the soprano and the bass, which are a third apart. Since the harmony doesn't change in the first measure, we can follow the soprano voice to the very end, and it's not until we transition to the second measure where we'll need to observe some type of motion. As we transition to the second measure, we encounter our next chord, an A major 7 chord. Notice how the soprano note, D, moves stepwise down to C sharp, while the bass moves up. This illustrates an example of contrary motion. Now, turning our attention to the bass and tenor, as they move from the third, D and F, they ascend in parallel motion. In the alto and tenor, the two voices are a third apart. When we move to the next measure, the alto does not move while the tenor moves up in stepwise motion. This would be an example of oblique motion. Lastly, observing how the bass, tenor, and alto move from one D minor chord to another, but in a different register, we notice that none of the rules have been violated. This is because it would be considered a chord skip. Take a listen to this section of Mozart's Fantasy in D minor. The most important voice leading rules include 1. Approaching perfect intervals, and 2. Treatment of tendency tones, such as leading tones and chordal sevenths. A perfect interval, such as perfect octave, perfect fifth, or perfect unison, may not be approached in parallel motion. This rule helps avoid parallel fifths and octaves. Here's a great example of voice leading, demonstrating two voices approaching perfect fifths and perfect octaves. This passage is extracted from the ending of Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 1 in the first movement. First, let's examine the transition from the F7 chord to the B-flat minor chord. We'll observe how these two voices approach a perfect octave. In this case, we have the C in one voice and the A natural in the bass voice. The bass moves up to the B-flat and the other voice moves down to B-flat. This would be an example of approaching a perfect octave in contrary motion. Now, let's look how two voices approach a perfect fifth, which occurs during the transition to the E-flat 7 chord. Just before the transition, a B-flat minor chord is played. Here we see a B-flat in the alto voice and an F in the tenor voice. The alto voice stays on the B-flat as the tenor voice on F moves down by step to E-flat. This would be an approach to a perfect fifth in oblique motion. Let's take a listen to this passage from Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 1. The leading tone has a strong tendency to lead up to the tonic. If the leading tone appears in an outer voice in one chord and the tonic appears in the following chord, the voice with the leading tone must resolve up to the tonic. However, if a leading tone is in an inner voice, it does not need to resolve up. The other option is to resolve down by skip. Dissonant voices, including especially the chordal seventh, also have a strong melodic tendency to resolve down by step, even if they appear in an inner voice. An exception arises when the chord that contains a chordal seventh is repeated. In such a case, the chordal seventh is repeated with the other notes of the chords, or shifted to another voice, so that its resolution is momentarily delayed until a new harmony enters. So this covers the 2 most important rules and the 5 kinds of motion in voice leading. These rules served as the cornerstone for the great composers. Over time, these composers manipulated these rules to craft their masterpieces, pushing the boundaries of traditional composition. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to check out some of our other videos. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to be up to date with our newest videos. Thank you.